to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. If supply chain enables industry, procurement is the key to its life. But like many industries, procurement is facing a talent shortage. That is especially true in the public procurement space. Over 70% of procurement organizations are struggling to find the right talent right now. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Talking Supply Chain. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I'm glad you've taken a few minutes out of your day to listen to us. In 2024, finding the right talent takes more skill than just posting a help wanted ad. It is a complicated effort that, if done correctly, can build a pipeline of talent that will keep your procurement operation humming. Unfortunately, too many people have leaky employee pipelines. So, joining me today to discuss the right approaches to building that talent pipeline is Daniel May, Director of Procurement Talent Development for the National Association of State Procurement Officials, or NASPO, I think, if I got that correctly, Dan. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into our topic today, and we've got something very exciting that I want to talk with you about a project that you're doing in local high school, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think many people probably don't know much about NASPO, so can you tell us a little bit about your organization and a little about yourself as well?
Sure. As you mentioned, NASPO, the National Association of State Procurement Officials, began almost 80 years ago, actually, and we were originally created to help with dealing with surplus property after World War II.
Hmm.
The organization has kind of evolved now. We are comprised of all 50 states, as well as primary members and chief procurement officers from U.S. territories. So our membership has grown over the years. We have involvement with every state. We're a nonprofit whose mission really is to promote government excellence by delivering better procurement solutions for the public.
Yep, yep. And then how about you? I mean, how did you land there, and what's kind of your background?
Sure. So like many public procurement practitioners, I fell into the field by accident.
Yeah.
My background is actually in mental health and substance abuse counseling, but I
Interesting.
spent a decade in plus in state government in Florida, working in the central procurement office. The last 4 years or so of that, I was the deputy chief procurement officer. And NASPO wanted to create this procurement talent development program early last year. I think they'd been working on it for several years with state members, and it was an incredible opportunity. So I took that as a chance to leave the state to go hopefully make an impact across generations of public procurement professionals in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So interesting. I landed in my job the same way by accident years ago. So I think it's probably a common thing that people end up where they are, not where they initially set out to
yeah,
go. But you gotta
absolutely,
find your passion, right?
exactly.
So, as you mentioned, NASPO deals with public agencies. We're talking governments primarily, right? Um,
Correct.
talent, the the ability to attract talent, not just in procurement but in general, is something that's been vexing industry, all industries, for the last several years now. From a procurement standpoint, do you guys see the same trouble, the same challenges in attracting talent in the I mean, in the public sector as the private sector does as well?
Absolutely. I think it's like you said, it is a universal challenge. And I think a lot of our government agencies, especially struggle with in the procurement sector, struggle with messaging and being able to effectively communicate what it is that we do, right?
Mhm.
So, you take anyone from the general public, a lot of them have no awareness of procurement. So they are not aware of the impact of those services. So a big piece of this talent development puzzle for us is how do we tell that story differently? How do we convey and communicate the importance of a procurement function on services that people see and use every day? It's really hard to leave your house, to drive to work, to go out in public and not see something that was impacted by public procurement. A good example, utility poles or road construction projects, infrastructure, parks and recreations. Those may be at the local government, but it's all tied into public procurement and that impact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And when you think about those projects, I know there's lots of regulations and rules around procurement in the public space, right? Because the idea you're spending taxpayer money in this case, right? So there's
Correct.
more constraints, I guess, and things. So are there specific challenges that are unique in the space that you deal with and your organization deals in that makes finding the right talent, the right procurement talent, a more challenging endeavor
You
compared
know,
to a private company?
you really hit on a key piece of it. Obviously, finding someone, I don't want to in any way diminish private sector supply chain logistics work because it is critical to our success, I think, in not just business, but in the lives we live. However, government adds extra layers of challenge around policy that is not necessarily there in the private sector. So when we're looking for talents for public agencies, it's not just how many hard skills do you have and how good are you with market analysis or economics or those kind of principles. Underscoring that is how well can you evaluate impact versus cost, right?
Mhm.
So I think about something like foster care placement services that are procured at a state level in many states. Cost is not necessarily the driver there, nor should it be, right? We are looking for providers who can effectively assist teenagers and some of our most vulnerable children through some of the worst experiences of their lives. So does a person who's coming into our organization have the skill set, soft skills especially, to be able to understand that type of procurement is very different and I need to look at it with a different focus, still being good stewards of taxpayer dollars, but understanding there's a bigger community need than, say, an office supplies contract, which is something else that we frequently purchase from, right? Those are recyclable or reusable, disposable commodities that don't have that same level of impact. So that is definitely one of the skill sets that's different and more challenging, I think, on the public side.
Yeah. And that leads nicely, I think, in my next question, which was about skill sets. But as you're answering that, I'm thinking that maybe my question is not broad enough in some ways, and that is, are there specific skill sets that you should be prioritizing when looking for procurement in the public space? But it sounds like maybe it's very different depending on the type of procurement profession you're looking for, whether that's maybe more social services type procurement person as opposed to somebody who's dealing with road and infrastructure, for instance.
Absolutely. And one of the things we're working with our members on, sort of a concept of specialization within that procurement realm. Like government buys almost everything. I could tell you some really funny stories from Texas needing to procure cowboys, to help cattle off of roadways, to, you think of more somber, serious things like disaster relief and recovery efforts. Government is broad, and we are working with partners to think about maybe we need to target a career transition pipeline. Maybe the educators who no longer want to be in the classroom, those would make great educational grant procurement people.
Yeah.
Or you think about attorneys who are no longer interested in practicing in the way that they are. They could come in and become excellent legal experts, within procurement and administrative law for us. So I think there's such a broad range and need that we have to look at those specialties. The other place that we really have to start thinking about is that soft skill side. I know AI has been the topic of conversation for a few years now, especially this past year. How does it impact procurement? Will it replace some of those repetitive tasks? And if so, then at that point you're thinking, now we need much more judgment skills, critical thinking, ability to negotiate, vendor and client relations managers. So you're really getting into some of the softer skills rather than technical or hard skills. So all of those are aspects we're trying to balance, especially as we launch these talent development initiatives at high schools, colleges, community colleges, other transitioning workforce. It's really a long-term approach and initiative.
So, Certainly skill sets are important, and but demographics maybe of the population you're trying to pull from could play a role here as well, possibly. And I say this as because I just before we got on here, I was reading an article from a guy who talked about the role that football players and former football players can play in the supply chain in general because they're used to working individually but part of a team, right? And they hold some unique skill sets that can help out a supply chain management organization. So you mentioned teachers, for instance, kind of thing. Are there certain demographics of careers or groups of people that might be better fitting for public procurement positions?
I don't know if better fit is the word. I would say it's bigger needs. I think
Hmm.
we've gotten to a point in public procurement where everything, or well, any procurement really, private or public, is IT related, right? So information technology experts,
Yeah,
someone who understands cybersecurity, they are going to immediately find a role in public procurement. I mentioned educators. I would extend that to healthcare professionals, lawyers, attorneys, all those kind of functions. As you look through the supply chain, we need people who understand architectural services and design. We need engineers. It's truly such a broad topic. I think our idea is we elevate the field by, you don't necessarily want someone walking in with no procurement experience and suddenly being sitting down and buying $200 million worth of government services. So we want to be inclusive of everyone in every demographic, career, but at the same time, I think we're at a point of looking at, okay, what are those core competencies? How do we build those out? And how do we adjust those to people who are coming in or are interested in public procurement?
yeah,
NASPO about 8 years ago chose to partner with 9 universities supply chain programs because supply chain, I think at the time, was probably the closest we could get to procurement. Is it possible? Is it hopeful? Is it something we're going to work towards in the next several years to have a specific procurement degree? Absolutely. That is one of the initiatives we're working towards now.
yeah.
And I think that's a way to bring in some of those other potential careers, right?
And you mentioned the backgrounds, right? And then all of the various things, healthcare, all the different things that are dealt with in the public space and the government space. There, I think my guess, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that a procurement professional can go into a private business and they can buy widgets, and it doesn't matter what type of widget it is, the process is basically still the same, right? But
Correct.
in the government space, I would think that having some knowledge of the healthcare industry, for instance, if you're trying to procure healthcare services, that matters, right? Having some insight, because that healthcare industry operates very uniquely and differently than the widget provider in India that you're trying to buy from, correct?
Absolutely. And I've been trying to find a way to tie this into marketing and communication. So maybe I'll put myself out there and let your listeners help me. Like you said, like widget manufacturers, no matter where they are in the globe, they manufacture widgets. But these types of service, especially service agreements and contracts, they're a lot more challenging. It is very helpful to have some background, or I would caveat by that by saying at least some level of curiosity. If you don't have the experience, are you willing to learn? Are you curious about how the world works and what these different sectors look like?
Yeah.
And I can ask for listeners' help in saying, part of that marketing message I'd like to get out there is, yeah, you're a great private sector employee, but can you handle the public sector? Really to show that there is a different challenge there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a professor when I was in college, I mean, many, 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 many years ago now, who joked, I was a journalism student, and they joked that you were becoming a journalist because you're very curious about everything, but you don't want to be an expert at anything. So,
See, and that dovetails so well here. A good friend of mine, former chief procurement officer in several states, who's retired now, but we still have kind of conversations around this. He actually at one point in time was targeting journalism students because of that curiosity,
huh,
the ability to write, the
yeah,
ability to listen, right? So there's another major that has potential within the public sector, especially for procurement.
Th- Let me just tell you, because there's not enough journalism jobs, there are lots of journalism students looking for work.
Hey, let's go in that direction then.
Um, so yeah, I want to move on. Just talking about as companies and organizations and in the public and private sector look to build out their talent pipelines. Right? I mean, one of the ideas of any business is self-sustaining one. You want to keep making sure that there's new talent coming in as talent ages and retirements come out and whatnot. So what kind of supports or resources are available in the space and is it different in the public sector versus the private sector as far as those supports and resources that are out there?
I think that's part of what we're trying to build with our talent development
Mhm.
program are those sort of resources and support networks. Within the public sector, there are a number of associations, talent groups. The big one, obviously, the Association for Talent Development. They do a lot of continuing education for industry, for government on talent pipelines, how to grow, how to retain. All of those are very important. NASPO will be offering these types of resources to our state members, and probably other government entities here in the very near future. Some of our partners will be issuing or already have in some ways those kind of talent resources as well. I think about NASWA, which is the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. Obviously, their entire mission is working with states on the workforce side. So I think that's another great resource for people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, we've talked a lot. It's been a good conversation so far. I've learned a lot about the kind of public space so far in what you've talked about, but the goal ultimately is to develop that talent pipeline. And that's what you guys in NASPO is trying to do. And that extends down even before people get into careers, right? I mean, you mentioned reaching out to colleges about 9 years ago and kind of try to hope someday you get a procurement degree, right? Available at the
right.
university level. But you've also extended down into high schools as well. So I want to kind of shift to that kind of aspect of this and developing partners. So you've done a partnership with, and let me get this correctly, the Maryland Department of General Services Office of State Procurement,
Correct. That
correct?
is
That
that is
that
correct.
sounds like a government name to me, but but anyway, so you guys worked with them on a program in a local high school in Maryland. Can you tell us a little bit about that program and what you were hoping to achieve with it?
Sure. So we actually selected two high schools, and this was tied into an advanced placement personal finance course,
Mhm.
where NASPO helped sponsor those classes for these two high schools. And Maryland agreed to come in and during kind of a procurement week of that curriculum, really talk about what it's like a day in the life of a public procurement officer, if you will, the impact that it has on people's lives, the sort of heroes behind the scenes idea and mentality. And we saw a lot of positive response. A lot of the students at those schools were like, well, I'd never heard of public procurement before. And,
Yeah,
I think there's part of us who's like, yeah, well, of course you haven't, but we're working to change that. And that's really where those future pipelines live. These initiatives are not to fill vacancies that exist tomorrow or yesterday. These initiatives and this talent development program and these pieces that we're trying to put in place are about a 10 to 15, 20-year return on investment, right? That is, I think, one of the keys as folks are looking at their own pipelines is what is the sustainability and how far out are you willing to be content to see a return on investment? Too often we
yeah,
get focused on 3 months, 6 months, a year. Well, in a year, hopefully we'll add more high schools. But this program with Maryland really brought exposure. We had a number of students say, "I didn't know this existed." And what we're trying to say is, look, you everyone hears children talk about wanting to be, firefighters or doctors or attorneys. It's because they don't have the exposure to
yeah,
know that they can make an impact in a different way. That's
yeah.
that's really what this is about.
Yeah, I had a conversation similar to this with a supply chain professor a few months ago at a conference that I ran into him, and we were talking about the concept that people don't understand, even though people now are aware of supply chain, and certainly they've become a little more aware of procurement, but procurement's kind of a little more obscure compared to supply chain these days still.
Correct.
That but people don't know, especially high school kids and college kids don't know the career opportunities that are available within it, right? And we talked about you can be into IT and still move into supply chain, for instance. So, I mean, as you were saying, as you said earlier, you can be into IT and move into procurement. But people, I don't think they necessarily associate that. They say, well, I'm an IT kind of kid, or whatever. They focus there on typical IT careers and not necessarily an IT and procurement career,
Correct.
for
Yeah,
instance.
that is part of that exposure and awareness building that we're trying to do. Because the other reality, I'll give you a few statistics here for your listeners. I think the general estimate is that about 30% or so, and I'm just talking about the federal government workforce here in the procurement and contracting sector, will be eligible to retire in 5 to 10 years. And I believe there are about 300,000 federal jobs. So if you think about that, then you're looking at probably within 5 to 10 years a need for 100 to 150,000 jobs just at the federal level. Now multiply that across states, counties,
Wow.
cities. Um, it's a huge opportunity. I think we could wring our hands and say, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" Or we can embrace it as truly an opportunity to change the understanding of procurement, supply chain, and related fields, and really take this opportunity to get to younger people and say, "Look, this is the place that you can go and thrive and advance quickly."
Yeah.
When you have that sort of uh, job market opening, the advancement opportunities will be there.
Yeah. So I'm thinking, as you're talking about that, I'm thinking back to my high school days and thinking, well, when somebody came into my classroom to talk to me, it was kind of like, oh yes, good, a free day. I don't have to do any work. So so I guess the question then is, as you guys go into the classrooms and you talk to teens, how do you approach them to get them interested? I mean, obviously, education and awareness is a huge part of this,
Sure.
but how does that conversation go? How do you get their attention,
We
right?
give them excruciating detail on how to fill out each aspect of a request for proposal.
Well, that should do it for everybody, I would
Yeah,
think, right?
guaranteed free period at that point, right?
Yeah,
No, what we're trying to do, again, going back to that message I mentioned at the beginning, is letting you know that these careers exist and that you can make an impact in people's lives. I think as we get older and more established in our careers, we forget, and especially this generation, there is a desire to do good on the whole,
yeah,
not just to have meaning in their work, but to have impact in their community, impact in others' lives, to do good work. And at its forefront, public procurement requires a high level of transparency, a high level of ethics, and really when it's functioning well, it's impacting communities in positive ways.
yeah,
And that's my message.
yeah,
I have another procurement friend who says, "Oh, when I go out and talk to students, I tell them essentially procurement is you are a buyer with a large budget for a very discriminating client." And I'm
right,
like, that's an interesting concept as a way to kind of open that doorway and get attention, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and
So
yeah, I was gonna say, we've seen study after study, right, that talks about the younger generations wanting to work for companies or organizations that align with their values.
correct.
So if you can put that, what the public procurement professional does aligns with the values of improving communities, improving lives, that may resonate with them in some way.
And there's an element within that of, I think one of the big buzzwords has been sustainable procurement, and we often hear that and we think green purchasing,
Yeah,
environmental. People don't often think about sustainable procurement from the standpoint of exploited workers, child labor, trafficking, those kind of elements. But I'll say that again has to be at the forefront within public procurement as we move into the future. And it's
yeah,
another way to talk to younger people about those values. Do you, as a public procurement official, especially if you become a leader, do you want the clothing that you're purchasing for youth and juvenile justice programs to be, certified in some way that child labor was not involved in its manufacture? I as a person, I think that's a good direction, you
Yeah.
know, um, because again, it's also the values of, are we trying to rehabilitate and help those kids in the care of state systems? And if so, then we need to show that in the values of what we're purchasing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I want to get to two other things before we go about some of the things that you guys are doing and involved in to try to get this next generation of procurement
sure.
professionals. So let's start with the state procurement job shadow challenge that you guys have going on, and I think the goal is to engage students with the profession. So can you kind of talk about that and what that is?
Sure. So what we're trying to do there is work through our member offices, right? Like, NASPO will promote and support and guide and lead in so many directions around talent development and reaching these younger generations. But from an infrastructure standpoint, and our states are fantastic members and partners in this initiative. We need them and their staff to invite high school students into the office. Let them see what it's really like. It's a one day, like the old back when we were in school, like you go to a field trip somewhere and you see a possible job. That's what this really is.
Yeah.
And our state offices, I think, are having fun with it because they're seeing an opportunity again to reach that younger generation, to let them know this exists, to help them see the impact they can have. And it gets it also, the benefit is on the state side in that it helps our members and our public procurement professionals remember the purpose, what it is that they're buying for,
Yeah.
so I see it as a win-win situation. We're getting some really positive responses. Our hope is at the end of the challenge and next year, we're able to make it a little bit competitive, really get folks interested and be able to give away some cool prizes coming out
Yeah.
of that challenge.
You mean beyond a day out of class?
I mean, beyond a day out of class. Yes.
Because the two favorite days in school, right, are field trip day and the day the substitute is in, you're watching movies, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So,
So,
yeah,
and then for college students, we're doing case competitions. Those who are in supply chain programs, this past year, North Carolina State University graciously hosted it for us. We had about 16 teams, and to the winning top three placing schools of the case competition, they were given cash award prizes as well. So
yeah,
it's another avenue to try to be creative and innovative to bring folks into the field.
yep. And then
Yeah.
another component, not of that, but another thing you guys are doing is an apprenticeship programming that you're working on, a pilot for that, I understand. So
Yes,
what is that
correct.
about?
So again, with the state of Maryland, all of our states are tremendous partners. Maryland, though, I'll give them a special shout out here on this podcast from the high school programming. But the apprenticeship program, it'll sort of be the first of its kind for state government. I think apprenticeships are often seen as sort of blue collar manual labor positions, and Maryland was gracious enough to say, hey, we want to do this for procurement apprentices. So essentially, NASPO is helping with funding of three positions for the state of Maryland's General Services Central Procurement Office. They will have the opportunity to work in Maryland while also attending school to get an associate's or a bachelor's degree. And we plan to do that over a 3-year period and so each year they're learning new skills, they're promoting in, and then by the time they're done with the apprenticeship, they should be at a fairly higher salary level with practical work experience and an education to boot. So it's another pathway into the field.
Yep. And I mean,
Yeah,
that's what all this is about, right? Is creating the pathways
absolutely.
and creating that pipeline, as we talked about in the beginning. Want to just ask you one more question here in the final minutes that we have left. That is simply that, uh, from an advice standpoint, right? can you leave what piece of advice would you give organizations that are struggling to attract procurement talent these days, especially that early career talent? I mean, I know you mentioned a number of things here, but what's that big overarching piece of advice that you'd say to those organizations to help improve their efforts?
Sure. So I think that's two pieces really. The first is don't be afraid to try new things. Not every pathway that you attempt to create will be successful, but we have to try to get out of the traditional mindset that we've had around talent. Go to the students, go to those transitioning in their careers. I military veterans and veterans families are an untapped resource. We will hopefully have a really great announcement in 2025 about some of the work we're doing in that area. So that is the first piece. Really, really go out of your way, try to be as innovative as possible, and look for the blank space almost. Like what are you missing because it's not there? And if it's not there, go figure out a way to pull it in. Um, and the second piece, and this is something we are kicking off in January, is especially if you're trying to bring in younger talent, find a way to put them into a workshop, a focus group, give them some resources, and have them tell you the best way to bring them into this field. So we are planning to kick off a kind of student roundtable in January with a number of our students that we've been working with across these various initiatives for them to tell us what needs to change with how we approach social media, what needs to change with our recruiting efforts, what needs to change to make this a better environment for them.
Yeah.
Those
Yeah.
would really be my two kind of overarching things.
Yeah, I mean, talent shortages in whether it's procurement or any other industry or job function, they're not going away anytime soon.
Correct.
And the idea that you just like the 1970s idea of just post a job and a help wanted ad and you're going to get lots of people doesn't work anymore. I mean, you got to reach out to people differently these days and attract that talent and get them excited about the career. So,
That's it.
thank you, Dan. I appreciate it. If the last question I promise. If people want to learn more about NASPO or get in touch with the organization to learn more, what's the best way to do that?
Sure. I would say start with our website, naspo.org, NASPO.org. You can also find us on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, Daniel May at NASPO. Feel free to email me if you want to talk about talent or any other thing really. It's DMAY, so DMay at naspo.org. And really that is the beginning of this journey. From there we will launch you into as many directions as you want to explore with us.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I think our audience, a lot of times, our audience obviously is focused on the private sector because obviously there's a lot of business, but the public sector is a massive employment opportunity and in procurement and other fields as well. So a lot of opportunities there. So thank you so much for sharing some time today and some insight on what you guys are doing to help solve this talent shortage that exists. Um, want to thank my guest today, Daniel May, and also special thank you to all of you that listened to us today. I hope you guys learned something with this conversation. I greatly appreciate it. New episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it at scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So be sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Until next time, this is Brian Straight, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Straight, and thank you for listening.